Arthur Sterling looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror of a public restroom, barely recognizing the man staring back. The designer stubble had been replaced by a rough, unkempt beard, and the sharp clarity in his eyes was hidden behind a pair of cheap, scratched spectacles. He adjusted the frayed collar of his polyester delivery uniform, feeling the synthetic fabric itch against skin accustomed to Egyptian cotton. For years he had been surrounded by yes-men and vultures, people who smiled at his wealth while sharpening their knives for his downfall. He needed to know if integrity still existed in a world obsessed with status, or if he was merely a walking bank account to everyone he knew. He stepped out into the humid morning air, the smell of diesel and asphalt replacing the sterile scent of his penthouse office. His chariot was no longer a bulletproof limousine, but a dented 2012 delivery van that groaned every time the ignition turned. As he gripped the steering wheel, he felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with a cold, analytical curiosity. He had set up a dummy corporation to handle his logistics, ensuring no one in his inner circle knew where he had vanished to. Today he wasn't the CEO of Sterling Tech. He was Artie, a man living paycheck to paycheck, carrying the weight of other people's consumerism on his back. The first delivery of the morning took him to a high-end legal firm, a place where he had previously spent thousands on consulting fees. As he hauled a heavy crate of office supplies through the service entrance, the security guard didn't even look up from his phone, merely grunting and pointing toward the freight elevator. In his former life, the doors would have been held open, and a chorus of greetings would have followed his every step. Now he was invisible, a ghost in the machinery of commerce, relegated to the hallways that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. It was the first lesson of his experiment. Respect was a currency he had stopped carrying. He reached the reception desk, where a young woman was frantically organizing files while barking orders into a headset. When Arthur cleared his throat to request a signature, she didn't look at his face, only at the clipboard he held. Her eyes darted to his dirt-stained boots with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if his presence were a physical blemish on the polished marble floor. She snatched the pen from his hand without a word, signed a jagged line, and shoved the clipboard back so hard it nearly hit his chest. He watched her for a moment, recording the cruelty in his mental ledger, realizing she was the same assistant who had once brought him tea with a trembling, worshipful hand. The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge as he navigated the narrow, crowded streets of the garment district. The heat in the van was oppressive, the air conditioning having failed miles ago, leaving him drenched in sweat that made the uniform cling to his ribs. Every delivery was a race against a digital clock that didn't care about traffic or human fatigue. He felt the physical toll of a life he had only ever viewed from the safety of a spreadsheet, the ache in his lower back becoming a constant companion. It was a visceral reminder of the distance between those who make the rules and those who must break their bodies to follow them. In a small, family-owned bakery, he encountered the first crack in the wall of indifference. The owner, a woman in her 60s with flour on her apron, noticed him swaying slightly from the heat as he dropped off a box of specialty baking powder. Without being asked, she handed him a cold bottle of water and a misshapen croissant that was too ugly to sell but still smelled of butter and warmth. "Take a minute, son," she said, her voice a soothing contrast to the honking horns outside. "The world won't stop spinning if you breathe for 5 minutes." Arthur thanked her, his voice cracking slightly, moved by a gesture that cost her pennies, but felt like a fortune in that moment. By evening, Arthur returned to a small, rented room in a part of the city he had previously only seen from the window of a helicopter. The walls were thin, echoing with the sounds of sirens and shouting neighbors, a far cry from the soundproofed sanctuary of his estate. He sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, eating a lukewarm meal from a plastic container, his mind racing with the data of the day. He saw how the world treated the lowly, how service workers were treated as obstacles rather than humans. He was beginning to see the true faces of the city's inhabitants, stripped of the masks they wore for the wealthy. Before sleep took him, he checked a hidden encrypted device to see the messages from his board of directors, who were frantic about his sabbatical. They were already discussing contingency plans and power shifts, proving that his absence was merely an opportunity for them to grab more control. He smiled grimly, the shadows of the small room dancing across his tired face. The test was working better than he had anticipated, and the list of those who deserved his trust was dangerously short. He closed his eyes, the smell of the old van still clinging to his skin, preparing for another day of being a nobody in a world that only valued somebody. The second week of the experiment began with a torrential downpour that turned the city streets into grey, slick rivers. Arthur struggled with a large, awkward package, destined for a luxury apartment complex he actually owned through a holding company. The cardboard was turning to pulp in his hands as he fought the wind, his boots soaking through within minutes. When he reached the lobby, the concierge, a man Arthur had personally approved for a Christmas bonus the year prior, refused to let him stand inside the vestibule to dry off. "Deliveries go around to the alley, Artie. Don't drip on the rug," the man said, his voice dripping with a newfound arrogance that comes from bullying those perceived as lower. Arthur stood in the rain-soaked alley, the cold water seeping into his bones as he waited for a freight elevator that seemed destined never to arrive. The injustice of it stung more than the cold. He knew the cost of that rug, but he also knew the value of the man he had thought the concierge to be. He was seeing the middle management of humanity, those who have a small amount of power and use it exclusively to crush those beneath them. As he finally made the delivery to a penthouse resident, a man who had once begged Arthur for a venture capital investment, he was met with a slammed door before he could even offer a greeting. The resident didn't recognize the titan of tech in the drenched, shivering delivery man. Amidst the coldness, Arthur began to notice a recurring figure on his route, a young man named Elias, who worked as a janitor in one of the mid-rise office buildings. Elias was always smiling, despite his hands being calloused from scrubbing floors and hauling trash. On several occasions, they shared a bench in a small, neglected park during their brief lunch breaks. Elias spoke of his dream to go to medical school, working 3 jobs to support his younger sister's education while saving every penny for his own. He treated Arthur as an equal, a fellow soldier in the war of the working class, sharing his sandwiches and offering tips on which routes had the fewest potholes. The contrast between the elite he once called peers and the people he now stood beside was becoming a chasm. One afternoon, Arthur witnessed a wealthy businessman berate a young waitress for a minor spill, calling her useless and a drain on society. Arthur felt a surge of protective rage he hadn't experienced in years, his hands clenching into fists. He had to remind himself of his role, staying silent as he moved past the scene, but the incident burned into his memory. He was learning that those with the most often had the least to offer in terms of basic human decency, while those with nothing were willing to share their last crust of bread. His experiment took a darker turn when he was assigned a delivery to the warehouse district, an area rife with small-time corruption. A local foreman tried to extort an unloading fee from him, threatening to report him for being late if he didn't hand over $20. It was a small amount, but it represented a significant portion of a delivery driver's daily wage. Arthur watched the man's eyes, seeing the casual cruelty of someone used to taking from the vulnerable. When Arthur refused, the foreman shoved him against the van, the metal rattling against his spine. The violence was brief but pointed, a reminder that for the poor, physical safety is often a luxury. That night, Arthur sat in his cramped room, nursing a bruise on his shoulder and reflecting on the moral rot he was uncovering. He realized that his wealth had acted as a shield, not just from poverty, but from the truth of human nature. He had lived in a curated reality, where everyone was on their best behavior because he held the keys to their success. Now, without the shield, he was seeing the raw, unfiltered blades of ego and malice. He began to categorize his findings. The blind, who simply didn't see the poor, the cruel, who enjoyed the power dynamic, and the few, who saw the human being behind the uniform. The few included a weary nurse who stayed late to help him carry a heavy medical supply box into a clinic, and a street performer who gave him a thumbs up every morning. These small anchors of humanity kept Arthur from spiraling into total cynicism. He found himself looking forward to his conversations with Elias more than he had ever looked forward to a board meeting. There was an authenticity in their exchange that no contract could ever replicate. He was discovering that trust wasn't built on shared interests or mutual profit, but on the simple, unrewarded choice to be kind when no one was watching. As the chapter of his undercover life reached its midpoint, Arthur prepared for the most difficult test yet. He decided to introduce a problem, a lost package that was actually a test of honesty, for a high-profile client who prided himself on his ethics. He wanted to see if the man would report the error or try to profit from the mistake of a stupid delivery driver. The tension was mounting, and Arthur could feel the weight of his 2 lives colliding. He was no longer just an observer, he was becoming a judge, and the sentences he was preparing to hand out would be life-altering for everyone involved. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday, a day of suffocating humidity and mounting pressure. Arthur delivered a misplaced high-value electronic item to the home of Julian Vane, a prominent philanthropist and a man Arthur had considered a personal friend. The package, deliberately mislabeled, but clearly containing a prototype worth thousands, was handed over with a feigned apology for the delay. Arthur watched Julian's eyes widen as he realized the mistake. Instead of correcting the driver or calling the company to report the error, Julian smirked and told Arthur to get lost before I report your incompetence. It was a cold, calculated theft, executed by a man who gave millions to charity just for the tax breaks. The betrayal hit Arthur harder than the foreman's shove. He had invited Julian to his home, shared expensive scotch with him, and listened to his speeches on the moral duty of the rich. To see the man so easily discard his principles for a piece of hardware he didn't even need was the final straw. The experiment was no longer a curiosity. It was a revelation of a systemic infection of the soul. Arthur walked back to his van, his heart heavy with a mixture of grief and cold, clinical fury. The ivory towers he had built were populated by ghosts and thieves, and he was the one who had funded their delusions. The same afternoon, the physical world seemed to conspire against him. The old van finally gave out in the middle of a busy intersection, its engine dying with a pathetic metallic wheeze. Traffic backed up for blocks, and the air filled with the aggressive cacophony of horns and shouted insults. Arthur stood in the street, trying to push the heavy vehicle toward the curb, but he was exhausted and alone. Drivers leaned out of their luxury cars to scream at him, calling him a failure and a loser who shouldn't be on the road. Not one person stepped out to help, their time being far too valuable to assist a man in a stained uniform. Just as he felt his strength failing, a familiar figure appeared through the haze of exhaust fumes. It was Elias, who had just finished his shift at the office building nearby. Without a word, Elias put his shoulder to the back of the van and began to push. Together they managed to move the heavy machine into a side street, out of the flow of traffic. Both men were panting, drenched in sweat and grime. Elias wiped his forehead and grinned, patting the side of the rusted van. "She's a stubborn one, Artie, but we got her. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Arthur looked at Elias, really looked at him, and felt a lump form in his throat. Here was a man who had every reason to be bitter, who struggled every day just to survive, yet he didn't hesitate to help a stranger in the middle of a chaotic street. "I'm fine, Elias," Arthur managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't think anyone would stop." Elias laughed, a genuine, hearty sound. "Most people only see what they want to see, my friend. But we're all in the same boat, right? We got to look out for each other." In that moment, the break was complete. The billionaire was gone, and only the man remained. That evening, a message arrived on Arthur's secure device. His chief operating officer, Marcus, whom he had trusted for 15 years, was moving forward with a hostile takeover, citing Arthur's erratic behavior and unexplained disappearance as grounds for removal. Marcus was the one person Arthur thought would hold the line. The betrayal was total. His friends were thieves, his employees were traitors, and the only person who had his back was a janitor who didn't even know his real name. The reality of his life was a hollow shell, a monument to a success that had isolated him from everything that actually mattered. The weight of it all crashed down on him in his small, dark room. He sat on the floor, the shadows stretching long across the peeling wallpaper, and realized that he couldn't go back to the way things were. He couldn't simply put the suit back on and pretend he hadn't seen the filth beneath the fingernails of the elite. The experiment had served its purpose, but the cost had been his innocence. He had found what he was looking for, but it wasn't a who, it was a what. He had found the truth about the fragility of social constructs and the immense power of a single, uncoerced act of grace. As the night deepened, Arthur began to make his plans. He wasn't going to just return, he was going to descend. He spent hours on his encrypted laptop, moving assets, recording the evidence he had gathered of Julian's theft and Marcus's treachery. He was preparing a storm that would wash away the pretenders and elevate the worthy. The delivery driver was about to make his final, most important delivery. The break had cleared the way for a reconstruction, and Arthur felt a cold, sharp clarity he hadn't felt in decades. The game was over, and the reckoning was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with the clinical precision of a guillotine. Arthur didn't go to the delivery depot. Instead, he drove the rusted van one last time to a quiet underground garage in the financial district. There, his personal security team, the only ones he had kept in the loop, waited with a black sedan and a tailored suit that felt like a suit of armor. He stepped out of the van, leaving the stained uniform on the driver's seat like a discarded skin. As he dressed, the transformation was jarring. The rough beard was trimmed to a sharp edge, the glasses replaced by the cold, piercing gaze of a man who owned the skyline. The first stop was the headquarters of Sterling Tech. Marcus was in the middle of an emergency board meeting, standing at the head of the long mahogany table, mid-sentence about the unfortunate mental decline of our founder. The doors swung open with a heavy thud, and Arthur walked in. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a massive explosion. Marcus turned pale, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply walked to his chair, sat down, and placed a digital tablet on the table. "I've spent the last month as a delivery driver for this city," Arthur said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "I've seen how you speak when you think I'm not listening, and I've seen what you do when you think there are no consequences." He pressed a button, and the screen filled with Marcus's private emails, his secret meetings with competitors, and his plans to strip the company of its soul. The board members, many of whom had been complicit, looked at the floor. Within 10 minutes, Marcus was escorted out by security, his career ended, his reputation incinerated by the very man he tried to betray. The second stop was Julian Vane's Unity Gala. Arthur entered the ballroom just as Julian was taking the stage to accept an award for his humanitarian efforts. Arthur walked straight to the podium, ignoring the gasps from the audience. He held up a grainy video from a doorbell camera, the footage of Julian stealing the prototype package from the poor delivery driver and mocking him. "Character," Arthur told the stunned crowd, "is what you do when you think the person in front of you can do nothing for you." Julian's face turned a mottled purple, the applause dying into a chorus of hushed whispers and social ruin. The legal and social fallout was immediate and irreversible. Contracts were cancelled, lawsuits were filed, and the elite who had failed Arthur's silent tests found themselves ostracized from the circles they once dominated. Arthur moved through the wreckage of their lives with a cold efficiency. He wasn't acting out of petty revenge, but out of a deep-seated need for justice. He was purging his world of the parasites. Every person who had shown him cruelty during his month undercover received a letter, not of threat, but of termination. Business deals were severed, and support was withdrawn. The nobody they had insulted had turned out to be the everyone who controlled their fate. But the consequences weren't only for the guilty. Arthur sent his car to pick up the woman from the bakery. When she arrived at his office, she was nervous, clutching her apron. Arthur stood up and met her at the door. He didn't offer a business deal. He offered a partnership. He funded a citywide initiative for community kitchens, putting her in charge and ensuring she would never have to worry about a misshapen croissant being her only surplus again. Her eyes filled with tears as she recognized the man she had given water to. "You were just a thirsty boy," she whispered. Arthur smiled. "And you were the only one who saw it." Then there was Elias. Arthur found him in the same park where they had shared sandwiches. Elias was sitting on the bench, looking tired, his janitor's uniform stained with bleach. When the black car pulled up and Arthur stepped out, Elias didn't recognize him at first. Then he saw the eyes. He stood up slowly, a look of confusion crossing his face. "Artie?" he asked tentatively. Arthur nodded, sitting on the bench beside him, oblivious to the fact that his $1,000 suit was touching the peeling paint. "My name is Arthur," he said. "And I think it's time we talked about that medical school application." The world was reeling from the Sterling experiment, as the press began to call it. It was a scandal that exposed the rot in high society, but for Arthur, it was the first time he felt truly clean. He had destroyed the illusions of his old life, but he had also found the bedrock of his new one. The consequences were a reset button, a chance to build something that wasn't just profitable, but honorable. He watched Elias's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in, a mixture of shock and dawning hope that was more valuable than any stock dividend Arthur had ever received. The dust eventually settled, but the landscape of Arthur's life was permanently altered. He didn't return to the isolated penthouse of his past. Instead, he moved into a more modest home closer to the heart of the city, keeping the old delivery van in a glass-walled garage at his headquarters, a permanent reminder of the lessons learned on the asphalt. Sterling Tech was restructured into a company that prioritized ethical leadership, with a new board of directors chosen not for their net worth, but for their history of integrity. The yes men were gone, replaced by people who weren't afraid to tell the truth. Elias's life changed overnight, but his character remained unshakable. With Arthur's sponsorship, he entered one of the country's top medical programs, but he continued to spend his weekends volunteering at the community clinics Arthur had established. Their friendship remained the most honest thing in Arthur's life. They still sat in that same park occasionally, though now they discussed healthcare reform and philosophy instead of traffic and rent. Arthur realized that he hadn't just given Elias an opportunity. Elias had given Arthur a reason to believe in humanity again. The various villains of the story faced their own resolutions. Marcus found himself unable to find work in any major firm, his name becoming synonymous with treachery. Julian Vane's charities collapsed under the weight of his hypocrisy, and he retreated into a bitter, lonely retirement. The concierge who had refused Arthur entry into his own building was replaced by a veterans outreach program that hired people based on their service and reliability. The world didn't become a utopia, but in Arthur's sphere, the scales were finally balanced. Arthur also visited the young assistant at the legal firm. He didn't fire her. Instead, he required her to spend a month working in a customer service role for a non-profit, dealing with the same invisible people she had once looked down upon. It wasn't a punishment, but an education. He wanted her to understand that every person carrying a clipboard or a tray had a story, a family, and a soul. He was using his power to force empathy where it was lacking, hoping to plant seeds of change in the soil he had once helped to harden. 1 year after the experiment ended, Arthur stood on a balcony overlooking the city. It was the same view he had always had, but it looked different now. He didn't see a collection of rooftops and profit margins. He saw a grid of millions of lives, each one a series of choices. He thought about the weight of the boxes he had carried and the sting of the rain on his face. Those memories were more precious to him than his billions because they were real. They were the only things that had ever truly belonged to him. The experiment had proven his hypothesis. Wealth could indeed buy loyalty, but it was a brittle, hollow thing that shattered under pressure. Trust, however, was something that had to be earned in the trenches of everyday life. It was found in the small acts of kindness, the shared water, and the shoulder against a stalled van. He had set out to see who deserved his trust, and in doing so he had become a man who was actually worthy of receiving it. He was no longer just a billionaire, he was a person who had seen the bottom and decided to lift it up. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the skyscrapers, Arthur's phone buzzed. It wasn't a business alert or a crisis. It was a photo from Elias, a picture of his first-year medical textbooks and a note that simply said, "First exam down. Thanks for the push, Artie." Arthur smiled, a deep, genuine expression that reached his eyes. He put the phone away and took a deep breath of the city air. The delivery driver was retired, but the work he had started was only just beginning. He walked back inside, leaving the door unlocked behind him for the first time in his life. He no longer felt the need to hide behind steel and glass. He knew who his friends were, he knew who his enemies were, and most importantly, he knew who he was. The billionaire delivery driver had finished his route, and for the first time in a very long time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The experiment was over, and the resolution was a life defined not by what he owned, but by the trust he had finally found. Would you like me to create another story with a different setting or conflict, or perhaps explore a different niche, like a historical war drama or a high-stakes legal thriller?